On the 5th of May 2004, two of Europe's oldest and proudest airlines officially merged into a single holding group. Air France, founded in 1933. The airline that flew the supersonic Concorde and dominated European long-haul for decades. And KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, founded in 1919, the oldest airline in the world, still operating under its original name. The carrier that flew to Jakarta when the journey took 5.5 days. Together, they created Air France-KLM, at the time the world's largest airline group by revenue. The press conferences were held simultaneously in Paris and Amsterdam. The mood was celebratory. The synergies were projected. The future looked unified. 20 years later, the group carries over 100 million passengers annually, has just posted its highest ever operating result, and is actively acquiring new airlines across Europe, and it still hasn't fully decided whether it's one company or two. That tension between group efficiency and national identity, between French and Dutch interests, between the logic of integration and the politics of independence, is the defining story of Air France-KLM. It is a group that has spent 2 decades simultaneously cooperating and competing with itself. A group where the subsidiary that performs better consistently questions why it subsidizes the parent. A group where 2 governments with different priorities sit on the same board and have different ideas about what success looks like. It is one of the most fascinating governance stories in global aviation, and almost nobody tells it properly. To understand the tension, you need to understand what each airline brought to the merger and what each was afraid of losing. KLM in 2003 was desperate. It had posted a combined net loss of 572 million euros in the 2 financial years before the merger. It had tried and failed to merge with Alitalia, with British Airways, with Lufthansa, with various combinations of European carriers through the 90s. Every attempt had collapsed. The September 11 attacks had devastated its transatlantic traffic. KLM CEO at the time said publicly that the airline had almost no prospects. The merger with Air France was not a choice born from strength. It was survival. Air France was in considerably better shape. It was France's national carrier, majority owned by the French state, operating from one of Europe's most powerful hubs at Charles de Gaulle. It was larger than KLM in almost every metric. When the holding company was formed, the name went first, Air France, and the headquarters went to Paris. The French government reduced its stake from 54% to 44% as part of the transaction, but it remained the dominant shareholder and the dominant cultural force within the group. KLM negotiated protections into the merger agreement that reflected its fear of being absorbed and erased. The 2 airlines would maintain separate brands, separate operations, separate management, separate identities. The holding company would own both, but direct neither commercially. KLM kept its own CEO, its own board, its own Schiphol hub strategy, its own labor agreements, its own fleet decisions, to a significant degree. The merger was explicitly structured not as an absorption, but as a partnership of equals under a common roof. The problem with partnerships of equals is that they rarely stay equal. The first decade of the group's existence was genuinely successful. The complementary hub structure, Paris Charles de Gaulle, serving Southern Europe, Africa, and Latin America, and Amsterdam Schiphol, serving Northern Europe, Asia, and North America, created network connectivity that neither airline could have achieved alone. The code sharing, the joint loyalty program, Flying Blue, the coordinated transatlantic joint ventures with Delta Airlines generated synergies that the pre-merger projections had promised and that, for once, actually materialized. Between the merger in 2004 and 2008, the group generated net income of 3.2 billion euros. Margins rose, passenger numbers grew, the model appeared to be working. Then, the financial crisis hit. Then, the European short-haul market was disrupted by the rapid expansion of Ryanair and EasyJet. Then, fuel costs spiked. Then, the Gulf carriers began their assault on European long-haul connecting traffic. Then, COVID arrived, and the group needed government bailouts from both the French and Dutch states simultaneously. And throughout all of this adversity, a pattern emerged that made the governance tension explicit and uncomfortable. KLM was consistently more profitable, more operationally efficient, and more commercially disciplined than Air France. The margins were different, the cost structures were different, the labor relations were different. KLM had done the painful restructuring work in the years before the merger out of necessity. Air France, with a more powerful labor movement, a more interventionist government shareholder, and a more protected market position, had done less of it. The result was a group where the smaller subsidiary was carrying a disproportionate share of the financial weight. KLM contributed 4 times more to the group's overall operating profit than its relative size would suggest. Dutch employees and Dutch management began asking, with increasing directness, why a profitable and well-run airline was being consolidated into a group where its profits helped absorb losses generated by an airline with different cost disciplines and a different relationship with its unions. This is the central tension of Air France-KLM that no amount of diplomatic language in annual reports fully resolves. It is not a crisis, but it is a permanent structural friction that shapes every significant strategic decision the group makes. The friction became impossible to ignore in 2019 when the Dutch government did something that genuinely shocked Paris. Without informing the French government in advance, deliberately and pointedly without informing them, the Netherlands purchased a 12.68% stake in the Air France-KLM holding company, bringing its shareholding to roughly 14%, matching the French state's stake. The French finance minister was told 1 hour before the public announcement. The French president said the Dutch government needed to clarify its intentions. The French finance minister said that Air France-KLM should be managed without national public interference, a statement that required some composure to deliver, given that France had been the dominant national public shareholder in the group for 15 years. The Dutch move was not irrational. It was a defensive response to a series of decisions that the Dutch government felt had been made without adequate regard for KLM's interests. The group's new CEO, Benjamin Smith, a Canadian national appointed specifically because he was supposedly independent of French or Dutch allegiance, had been perceived in Amsterdam as tilting toward French interests in his early strategic decisions. A proposal to distinguish more sharply between the two brands, positioning Air France as the more premium offering, was interpreted in the Netherlands as a diminishment of KLM's positioning. The Dutch government's message was blunt. KLM matters to the Netherlands as economic infrastructure. If the group's governance doesn't reflect that, we will use our shareholder rights to ensure it does. The episode illustrated something that the elegant language of the original merger agreement had always partially concealed. Air France-KLM is not really a unified group in the way Lufthansa Group is. Lufthansa owns Swiss, Austrian, and Brussels Airlines, with controlling stakes that allow genuine integration of strategy, operations, and cost structures. Air France-KLM owns 2 proud national carriers, each backed by a national government with different priorities, each with its own history, culture, and constituency. The holding company sits above them, but cannot mandate the kind of deep operational integration that would resolve the efficiency gap, because deep integration would threaten the national identities and the political arrangements that made the merger possible in the first place. The operational dimension of this tension shows up most concretely in the contrast between the two airlines' cost structures and labor relations. Air France has one of the most complex industrial relations environments in European aviation. French aviation unions are numerous, well-organized, and politically connected in ways that give them leverage well beyond what their membership numbers alone would justify. Strike action at Air France has historically been more frequent and more disruptive than at most comparable European carriers. The French regulatory and political environment makes fundamental restructuring of labor agreements extraordinarily difficult. KLM operates in a different environment. The Dutch labor market has different traditions. KLM's workforce restructuring after the pre-merger crisis was painful but real. The cost per employee, the flexibility of scheduling, the productivity per staff member, these metrics have consistently differed between the two airlines in KLM's favor. The consequence is that on equivalent routes operated by equivalent aircraft, Air France's unit costs are structurally higher than KLM's. This is not a temporary gap that will close as efficiencies improve. It reflects deep institutional differences between the two airlines that cannot be resolved by a common holding company structure. KLM launched its Back on Track program in 2024, an internal restructuring effort targeting 450 million euros in cost savings and operational improvements. The program achieved its targets in 2025, delivering an operating result of 416 million euros on revenues of 13.2 billion euro. KLM CEO was direct in the results commentary. The program worked, but more structural strengthening remains necessary. The margin of 3.2%, while improved, remains below where a well-run European legacy carrier should be operating. Air France, meanwhile, continues to navigate a cost environment where strikes, disruptions, and structural labor costs impose a drag that its management acknowledges but cannot resolve through any straightforward operational measure. The group's 2025 full-year results, published in February 2026, tell a story of genuine improvement alongside persistent structural complexity. The Air France-KLM group carried over 100 million passengers in 2025, a first in its history. Group revenues reached 33 billion euros, up from 31.4 billion in 2024. The operating result exceeded 2 billion euros for the first time ever. The operating margin reached 6.1%, with earnings per share up 33% year-on-year. CEO Benjamin Smith described it as a robust performance, delivered in a challenging environment, with the premiumization strategy, investing in new cabins, high-speed Wi-Fi, and premium lounge experiences across both airlines, beginning to show measurable results in revenue per available seat kilometer. These are genuinely good numbers. They reflect real progress on cost discipline, fleet renewal. 35% of the group's fleet now consists of new generation aircraft, up 8 percentage points in a single year, and the commercial benefits of the transatlantic joint venture with Delta, which remains the group's most valuable commercial partnership. But dig beneath the group headline, and the structural asymmetry remains. KLM's 3.2% margin against what the full group is generating illustrates that the two airlines are not performing at the same level. The Transavia low-cost subsidiary, which is handling the transition of Air France's Orly operations, posted declining unit revenues in the fourth quarter. The cargo division underperformed. The complexity of managing four distinct operating brands, Air France, KLM, Transavia France, and Transavia Netherlands, within a governance structure that is simultaneously a unified group and a bilateral national arrangement, remains the defining management challenge. Into this already complex picture, Benjamin Smith is now adding more airlines. In July 2025, Air France-KLM initiated proceedings to take a 60.5% majority stake in SAS Scandinavian Airlines, a carrier that had just completed its own restructuring, switched from Star Alliance to SkyTeam, and was looking for the group backing its turnaround required. The Danish state will retain 26.4%. The deal, targeted to close in the second half of 2026, would add Copenhagen as a third European hub to Paris and Amsterdam. The strategic logic is clear. Both Charles de Gaulle and Schiphol are slot constrained, operating at or near their practical capacity. Copenhagen offers growth runway that Paris and Amsterdam cannot. SAS has only 15 wide-body aircraft, a fraction of what Air France and KLM operate, meaning the expansion potential under group ownership is substantial. Smith has been explicit about the ambition: more aircraft, more routes, more customers. The group has also taken a 2.3% stake in WestJet, the Canadian carrier, as part of a broader transatlantic partnership architecture involving Delta and Korean Air. And Smith said publicly in January 2026 that he hopes to integrate one or even two new airlines into the group during the year, with SAS and TAP Air Portugal in focus. The consolidation ambition is real and strategically coherent. A group with hubs in Paris, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, with SAS's Scandinavian network feeding long-haul departures and growing its own wide-body operation, with Transavia providing the low-cost layer across multiple markets, This is a genuinely powerful European aviation architecture. The question is whether the group's governance structure can handle the complexity of integrating SAS while simultaneously managing the existing tensions between Paris and Amsterdam. Integrating a third national carrier with its own identity, its own government shareholder, and its own workforce means adding a third set of national interests to a governance structure that already struggles to fully reconcile two. The Dutch government bought its stake in 2019 partly to ensure KLM was not disadvantaged within the group. A Danish government with 26.4% of SAS will have the same concern from Copenhagen. The group CEO's job, already one of the most politically complex in aviation, becomes more so. The honest assessment of Air France-KLM in early 2026 is this: it is a more successful group than it has ever been by financial metrics. The record operating result of over 2 billion euros, the 100 million passengers, the premiumization strategy that is genuinely improving yields on both long haul and short haul, these are real achievements. The fleet renewal program is accelerating. The SAS acquisition, if it delivers what Smith projects, could materially strengthen the group's European position. And it is still a group whose central strategic tension, how to run two proudly independent national airlines with structurally different cost bases and two national government shareholders with different priorities under a single holding company, has never been fully resolved. That tension has been managed, sometimes well and sometimes poorly, for 20 years. It will need to be managed for 20 more. Lufthansa solved this problem with controlling stakes and deep operational integration. IAG solved it with a strong central holding company that exercises genuine commercial authority over its constituent airlines. Air France-KLM has never been fully willing or able to do either, because doing so would require one or both national governments to accept a diminishment of their airline's independence that neither has so far been prepared to concede. The group that fights itself has just had its best ever year. It is about to get bigger and more complex. Whether it can grow into a genuinely integrated European aviation group, or whether it remains a structurally federated alliance of national carriers that cooperate when convenient and conflict when their interests diverge, that question will define its next 20 years as surely as it has defined its first